Colombia in the early 1980s was a nation teetering on the edge of a silent war. A war not fought on battlefields or between armies, but in the corridors of power, in the streets of Medellín and Bogotá, in the homes of politicians who dared to stand against an invisible empire. It was a war against men who did not wear uniforms, who did not march in formation, but who controlled vast territories with their wealth, their violence, and their ability to make people disappear. At the center of this war was one man, a man who refused to be silenced, who saw the dark tide rising and chose to fight against it. His name was Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, and for his defiance, he would pay with his life. Born in Neiva in 1946, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was not destined to be an ordinary politician. He was driven by ideals, by a deep-seated belief that Colombia could be better, that justice could prevail even in a land where corruption ran deep. A lawyer by training, he entered politics not for power, but for change. And as his influence grew, so too did his enemies. By 1983, he had been appointed Colombia's Minister of Justice, a position that placed him at the forefront of the government's battle against organized crime. But by then, organized crime was no longer a hidden force lurking in the shadows. It had infiltrated the highest levels of Colombian society. The most powerful of all was the Medellín Cartel, and at its helm was a man whose name had already become legend, Pablo Escobar. Escobar was no ordinary criminal. He did not operate like the drug traffickers of the past. He did not lurk in the underworld, avoiding the light. Instead, he walked the halls of power with the confidence of a man who knew he could buy anyone he needed to. He had made himself untouchable, or so he thought. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla saw through the facade. He understood what Escobar was, a man whose fortune was built on death, whose influence came not from generosity, but from fear. Unlike others, he was not willing to turn a blind eye. He was not willing to accept the gifts, the money, the empty promises of men who built their empires on cocaine. And so, he spoke. With unwavering conviction, he stood before the Colombian Congress and denounced Escobar for what he truly was, a drug trafficker. A criminal. A man whose money had corrupted institutions, bought elections, and turned a nation into his personal playground. He revealed the extent of Escobar's power, exposing the cartel's influence within the government, the police, even the judiciary. He did not hesitate. He did not back down. But words, no matter how powerful, have consequences. Lara Bonilla knew the price of his defiance. He knew that in naming Escobar, he had signed his own death warrant. Colombia was not a country where men like Escobar forgave. It was a country where silence was bought, and where those who could not be bought were buried. The threats began almost immediately. Whispers in the night, anonymous calls, men watching from a distance, their presence a silent warning. But Lara Bonilla was not easily intimidated. He had spent his life fighting for justice. He had no intention of stopping now. His denunciations had made him a hero to some, a marked man to others. And in the weeks and months that followed, as he continued his crusade against Escobar and the cartels, one thing became clear. The war had begun, and Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was standing on the front lines, alone. In Colombia, there were two versions of Pablo Escobar. To the poor, he was a benefactor, a man who built homes for the homeless, funded schools, and handed out money in the streets. To his followers, he was almost mythological, a man of the people, a modern-day Robin Hood who took from the wealthy and gave to those who had nothing. His image was carefully crafted, his reputation controlled, his generosity a powerful shield. But behind the smiling photographs, behind the carefully staged acts of charity, there was another Escobar, the real Escobar. A man whose empire was built on blood and cocaine, on corruption and terror. A man who controlled an international drug trade worth billions, flooding the streets of the United States with Colombian cocaine, turning entire cities into battlegrounds. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla saw what many chose to ignore. He saw the bodies piling up in the streets, the assassinations, the disappearances of those who spoke too much or stood in Escobar's way. He saw the power of the Medellín Cartel stretching far beyond Colombia, corrupting officials in foreign governments, laundering millions through banks that asked no questions. He saw politicians, judges, and police officers lining their pockets with cartel money, turning a blind eye in exchange for their own safety or for their own fortune. It was a power that could not be challenged easily. And yet, Lara Bonilla refused to stay silent. He watched as Escobar made his move into politics, presenting himself not as a criminal, but as a statesman. In 1982, Escobar had been elected as an alternate congressman in Colombia's House of Representatives, granting him political immunity and legitimacy. He stood in the halls of government, wearing a suit instead of a cartel leader's disguise, shaking hands with lawmakers, sitting at tables where the country's future was being discussed. It was a brilliant strategy, one that allowed him to operate in plain sight. And many welcomed him. They saw his wealth, his power, and they understood what aligning with him could bring. But Lara Bonilla saw something else. He saw a direct threat to the very foundation of Colombia's democracy. He watched as Escobar's influence grew, as he poured money into campaigns, as he silenced his critics with either cash or bullets. Lara Bonilla knew that if Escobar was not stopped now, soon there would be no stopping him at all. And so, he made a choice. He went before Congress and exposed the truth. He named Escobar for what he was, a criminal, a trafficker, a man who had no place in government. He showed the country the evidence. Reports linking Escobar to drug shipments, to violent killings, to an empire that stretched far beyond the borders of Colombia. The reaction was immediate. Escobar's allies lashed out, accusing Lara Bonilla of slander, of political gamesmanship. They questioned his motives, attacked his credibility. But Lara Bonilla stood firm, refusing to be swayed, refusing to let fear dictate his actions. For the first time, Escobar's carefully constructed image began to crack. But cracks were not enough. Escobar had built his empire on control of men, of information, of entire institutions, and he was not about to let one man ruin what he had spent years creating. Lara Bonilla had drawn a line, he had chosen a side, and Escobar had taken notice. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla knew that words alone would not be enough. If he was going to bring down Pablo Escobar, he needed evidence. Undeniable proof. Something so damning, so irrefutable, that even Escobar's allies in government could not ignore it. He did not have to search far. The Medellín Cartel had already left a trail of destruction. Hidden airstrips in the jungle, seized cocaine shipments, assassinated judges, and bribed officials. Their reach extended into every corner of Colombian society, but their greatest strength had always been the illusion of legitimacy. Escobar had worked tirelessly to present himself as a businessman, a philanthropist, a man concerned for the future of his country. Lara Bonilla tore that illusion apart. On national television, he revealed documents linking Escobar directly to the international drug trade. He showed evidence of cocaine laboratories deep in the Colombian rainforest, of massive shipments making their way into the United States. He named Escobar's lieutenants, his enforcers, the men who carried out his assassinations. He exposed the cartel's intricate web of money laundering, revealing how Escobar had turned drug profits into real estate, businesses, and political influence. And then he made his boldest move yet. He ordered a full investigation into Escobar's fortune, demanding to know where his money came from, who had helped him, and how he had managed to embed himself so deeply into the political system. Escobar had long claimed to be nothing more than a businessman, a cattle rancher with a keen sense for opportunity. But Lara Bonilla's investigation shattered that narrative. The money did not come from cattle. It did not come from real estate. It came from drugs, from smuggling, from death. The reaction was swift and brutal. Within days, Escobar's allies retaliated. Lara Bonilla was accused of corruption, of political bias, of fabricating evidence. The media, many of whom were already under cartel control, ran stories questioning his integrity. Political enemies called for his resignation, claiming he was obsessed with Escobar, that he was neglecting other matters of justice. But the attacks did not stop there. Anonymous calls threatened his family, his home was watched, his security detail was doubled, then tripled. He was warned, back off, let this go, look the other way like so many others had before him. But Lara Bonilla refused. He knew what Escobar was capable of, but he also knew the cost of silence. He had seen what happened when people allowed criminals to operate unchecked. He had seen judges murdered in their homes, police officers executed in broad daylight, entire institutions turned into weapons of the cartel. He would not be another name on the list of those who looked the other way. And so, despite the growing danger, he continued his fight. He pushed forward with extradition efforts, working to strip Escobar of his political immunity. He strengthened laws against money laundering, making it harder for the cartel to disguise its profits. He ordered further investigations into cartel influence, determined to expose every connection, every bribe, every betrayal. It was a war unlike any Colombia had ever seen, and Lara Bonilla had just made himself Escobar's most dangerous enemy. But in a country where justice was bought and sold, where power was dictated by violence, one question remained: how long could he survive? The moment Rodrigo Lara Bonilla exposed Pablo Escobar, he signed his own death sentence. He knew it, his allies knew it, and most of all, Escobar knew it. In Colombia, men like Escobar did not forgive. They did not forget. When threatened, they responded with absolute brutality. And Lara Bonilla had not just threatened Escobar, he had humiliated him, torn apart the myth of the generous businessman, dragged him into the light as a criminal, a trafficker, a man unworthy of political power. The retaliation was immediate. Newspapers and television networks, some under cartel influence, others simply afraid, began a campaign to discredit Lara Bonilla. Rumors spread that he was corrupt, that he had political ambitions beyond justice, that he had fabricated evidence against Escobar to advance his own career. The accusations were baseless, but in a country drowning in corruption, doubt was a powerful weapon. At the same time, the threats escalated. His security team intercepted calls promising death. Notes were delivered, unsigned, warning him to stay quiet if he valued his family's lives. Strange cars were spotted idling near his home, near his office, near his children's school. His closest advisors urged him to leave Colombia, to escape while he still could. But Lara Bonilla refused. "If I flee," he told a friend, "then what hope is there for this country?" His fight was not just against Escobar, but against the system that had allowed men like Escobar to thrive. He knew the danger, but he also knew that if he backed down, if he caved to fear, it would send a message that no one could stand against the cartels. Escobar, however, was not content with just intimidation. Lara Bonilla had opened the door to extradition, the single greatest threat to the cartels. If extradition became law, if Colombian criminals could be sent to the United States to face justice, then Escobar's empire would crumble. American prisons could not be bribed, American judges could not be bought, and that, Escobar knew, could not be allowed. So, he escalated. On March 20, 1984, authorities raided Tranquilandia, a massive jungle drug lab belonging to the Medellín Cartel. Over 10 tons of cocaine were seized, a catastrophic loss for Escobar's operation. Lara Bonilla had played a key role in coordinating the raid, and now there was no turning back. The cartel had declared war. Days later, Escobar's men made their move. They launched an assassination attempt against Lara Bonilla's close ally, General Miguel Maza Marquez, the head of Colombia's intelligence agency. The attack failed, but the message was clear. Anyone who stood with Lara Bonilla would be targeted. His friends urged him to go into hiding. Government officials whispered that he should step down, let someone else take the fight forward. Even his own security team began to doubt if they could protect him. But Lara Bonilla would not run. He had chosen his path, and now there was only one way forward. He continued his work. He ignored the death threats. He doubled down on his calls for extradition, for stronger laws against organized crime, for an end to cartel control. He moved through Bogotá with armed guards, but no amount of protection could change the reality he faced. Escobar had made a decision. Lara Bonilla would not live much longer. The only question was when. By April 1984, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla knew his time was running out. The threats had become part of his daily life. He barely reacted when his security team intercepted yet another anonymous message promising his death. He had long since stopped counting the times he was warned to flee. His enemies were no longer hiding in the shadows. They were closing in, their message clear: stop or die. But he would not stop. He threw himself deeper into his work, as if sheer determination could outpace the death sentence hanging over him. He pushed for more arrests, more investigations, more measures to dismantle the cartel's financial networks. He spoke with foreign leaders, urging international cooperation against drug trafficking. He met with Colombia's president, Belisario Betancourt, insisting that extradition was the only way to break Escobar's grip on power. Some of his allies began to distance themselves. They saw what was coming, and they did not want to share his fate. Even within the government, whispers grew. Some believed he had gone too far, that he was pushing too hard against an enemy too powerful to defeat. The reality was undeniable. Escobar's influence reached into the highest levels of the state. There were men in office who owed their positions to cartel money, men who looked at Lara Bonilla not as a hero, but as a disruption to the system they had learned to navigate. The walls were closing in. Still, Lara Bonilla refused to give in to fear. He continued to appear in public, continued to move through Bogotá with his security detail. He believed that if he let the threats dictate his life, then the cartels had already won. His family, however, saw what he would not. His wife begged him to be careful. His friends urged him to leave the country, at least temporarily. But he would not. He had always known that this fight would cost him something. He just didn't know when the price would be collected. And then, in late April, the final warning came. A high-ranking official, someone close to the government's security forces, sent word to Lara Bonilla's office. The message was brief. The cartel had made their decision. The assassination order had been given. The attack was imminent. His advisors urged him to stay inside, to move to a safe house, to change his routine. Lara Bonilla listened, but did not alter his schedule. His defiance had brought him to this point, and he would not let fear dictate his final days. On the night of April 30th, 1984, he stepped into his armored Mercedes-Benz, surrounded by his security detail. The streets of Bogotá stretched before him, a city he had fought for, a city that now held his fate. Unbeknownst to him, his killers were already waiting. The trap was set, and Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was heading straight into it. The night of April 30th, 1984, was like any other in Bogotá. Bustling streets, headlights cutting through the darkness, the hum of life continuing as it always had. But for Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, it would be his last. His armored Mercedes-Benz moved through the city, flanked by his security detail. He had been warned, more than once, that his days were numbered. The threats were no longer just words, the cartel had decided. But even now, with the weight of inevitability pressing down on him, he did not hide. He did not retreat. The car weaved through the streets, the bodyguards on high alert. They had seen what the cartel was capable of. Car bombs, ambushes, bullets that found their mark in broad daylight. Yet for a moment, the night seemed ordinary. Lara Bonilla sat in the back, lost in thought. Then came the sound of approaching motorcycles. Fast. Too fast. His guards barely had time to react. Two motorcycles pulled up alongside the minister's car. The riders wore no masks. They had no need to hide. They were sicarios, trained killers, sent by the most powerful drug lord in the world. Before the driver could swerve, before the guards could draw their weapons, the gunman opened fire. A rain of bullets tore through the vehicle. Glass shattered. Metal twisted. The security detail scrambled, returning fire, but it was too late. Lara Bonilla was slumped in his seat, his body riddled with bullets. Blood soaked his suit, pooling onto the leather beneath him. His driver, in a desperate attempt to escape, accelerated wildly, the engine roaring against the chaos, but the damage was done. The motorcycles sped away, vanishing into the night. The entire attack had taken seconds. By the time the car screeched to a halt outside a hospital, it was already too late. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, the man who had dared to stand against Pablo Escobar, was gone. News of the assassination spread like wildfire. Within minutes, Bogotá was alive with sirens, with panicked voices, with the realization that the war against the cartels had just entered a new and more terrifying chapter. And somewhere, in the shadows of his empire, Pablo Escobar had sent a message. Those who stood against him would not stand for long. Word of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla's assassination spread across Colombia with the force of an earthquake. The radio stations interrupted their programming. Newspapers rushed to print special editions. Televisions broadcast the grim news. Colombia's Minister of Justice had been gunned down in the streets of Bogotá. Shock turned to fear. Fear turned to outrage. Lara Bonilla had known his life was in danger, but his murder, so public, so brazen, proved what many had feared all along. The drug cartels were not just a criminal force operating in the shadows. They were more powerful than the government itself. They did not fear the law. They did not fear justice. They had silenced their loudest opponent in a hail of bullets, and in doing so, they had declared war on the Colombian state. The streets of Bogotá, usually teeming with life, fell into an uneasy silence. A chilling realization set in. If a government minister, protected by armed guards and bulletproof cars, could be hunted down and executed, then who was safe? Inside the halls of power, chaos reigned. President Belisario Betancourt convened emergency meetings, surrounded by ministers and military officials, each of them now looking over their shoulders, wondering who would be next. Lara Bonilla's allies were in mourning, but they were also in terror. The message had been clear: stand against the cartels, and you will die. But Escobar had miscalculated. He had believed that killing Lara Bonilla would silence the movement against him. That fear would keep the government paralyzed. That politicians, judges, and law enforcement would fall back into the familiar rhythm of bribery and complicity. Instead, the opposite happened. Colombia erupted in anger. The assassination was too much, too blatant. Protests broke out in the streets. The people, who had once admired Escobar's supposed generosity, now saw the true cost of his power. His myth as a benevolent Robin Hood was unraveling. He was not a hero, he was a murderer. The government, forced to act, finally took its first real step against the cartel. Within days, President Betancourt signed a decree reviving a measure that Escobar feared more than death itself: extradition. Lara Bonilla had fought for it while he was alive, and now, in death, he had become its most powerful symbol. For the first time, Escobar faced the real possibility of being sent to the United States, where his money, his influence, and his army of sicarios would mean nothing. Panic rippled through the cartel ranks. They had eliminated Lara Bonilla, but in doing so, they had awakened something far more dangerous: an enraged government, backed by a public that had finally had enough. The war had begun, and this time, there would be no turning back. The assassination of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla had been meant as a final warning, a demonstration of the cartel's power, a message that no one who challenged Pablo Escobar would live long enough to see victory. But instead of silencing the fight against him, Escobar had made himself the most wanted man in Colombia. The government moved swiftly. Within days, security forces raided cartel properties across Medellín, targeting known associates, seizing shipments, freezing assets. The police, who had once looked the other way in exchange for bribes, now faced pressure from the highest levels of government: crack down or be considered complicit. But Escobar did not survive by underestimating his enemies. He had seen men in power come and go. He knew that the anger in Bogotá would not last forever. The people might demand justice now, but eventually fear and corruption would take hold again. The government might talk tough today, but tomorrow they would remember what happened to those who crossed him. Still, there was one threat he could not ignore: extradition. The word itself was enough to send a ripple of unease through the entire cartel network. Before Lara Bonilla's murder, the policy had been debated, stalled, blocked by politicians under Escobar's influence. But now, it was law. And if there was one thing Escobar feared, it was an American prison. In Colombia, money could buy safety, judges could be bribed, police could be paid off. Even inside the most secure prisons, a man like Escobar could live like a king. But in the United States, there would be no deals, no luxuries, no escape. Escobar and his men knew what had to be done. First, they launched a public relations war. Through his network of journalists and allies in the media, Escobar painted himself as the victim. He claimed Lara Bonilla's death was tragic, but accused the government of using it as an excuse to wage war on honest businessmen. He reminded the poor of Medellín of the schools and housing he had built, the money he had given, the food he had provided. And when words weren't enough, he turned to violence. Politicians who supported extradition began receiving threats. Some were attacked. Some were assassinated. Judges who dared to enforce the new policy found themselves targeted. Bombings, kidnappings, executions. Escobar sent a message loud and clear. Anyone who tried to send him to the United States would not live long enough to see it happen. And yet, despite his efforts, the government did not back down. For the first time, Escobar was not in control. He had killed Lara Bonilla, but in doing so, he had changed the game. He had declared war on the Colombian state, and this time, the state was ready to fight back. But Escobar was not a man who lost easily. If the government wanted war, he would give it to them. The death of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla had set Colombia on fire. But Pablo Escobar was not a man who retreated in the face of pressure. If the government thought they could dismantle his empire, he would remind them who truly controlled the country. The war had begun, and Escobar did not play by the rules. In the months following Lara Bonilla's assassination, Colombia descended into chaos. Judges, journalists, police officers, anyone who spoke against the Medellín Cartel became a target. A judge reviewing extradition requests was gunned down in front of his family. A prominent journalist investigating Escobar's operations was found dead, a warning carved into his skin. Entire police stations were bombed, their officers slaughtered. The government had made its move, and now Escobar was making his. But he did not stop at violence alone. He knew that terror was only part of the strategy. He also needed the people on his side. And so, while bullets rained down on his enemies, he turned to propaganda. Through intermediaries, Escobar funded massive public campaigns against extradition. Billboards, radio ads, newspaper editorials, all spreading the same message. A Colombian should be judged in Colombia. He called those who supported extradition traitors and puppets of the United States. He painted himself not as a criminal, but as a patriot. And for many, the message worked. The poor of Medellín, who had seen Escobar build their neighborhoods, their schools, their hospitals, still viewed him as a hero. He gave them money. He gave them hope. And now, he was telling them that the government wanted to sell Colombia's sovereignty to the Americans. It was a dangerous combination. Violence in the streets, propaganda in the air, fear in the government. And it was working. Some politicians, terrified for their lives, withdrew their support for extradition. Some judges resigned rather than face a cartel death squad. Police officers either took bribes or looked the other way, unwilling to fight a war they could not win. The Colombian state was crumbling under Escobar's assault, but there were still those who refused to bend. President Betancourt, shaken by the assassination of his minister, vowed that Colombia would not surrender. He ordered the creation of elite task forces, special military operations designed to hunt down cartel leaders. The extradition treaty remained in place, and the first names were added to the list. Escobar's days of operating in the open were over. He could no longer walk freely, no longer campaign for office, no longer pretend to be a businessman. He had become the most wanted man in Colombia. But a wounded animal is the most dangerous kind. Escobar knew he could not stop now. If he was going down, he would take the entire country with him. And so, the violence escalated once more. Bombs in government buildings, massacres in the countryside, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. The war Rodrigo Lara Bonilla had tried to prevent had arrived, and Colombia would never be the same again. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was buried with full honors, his coffin draped in the Colombian flag, his name forever etched in the history of a nation at war with itself. His murder had not silenced the fight against the cartels, it had ignited it. In the years that followed, the war escalated beyond what anyone could have imagined. Pablo Escobar's reign of terror reached its peak. Bombings, assassinations, the relentless pursuit of absolute power. But the seeds of his downfall had already been planted. Lara Bonilla's assassination had been a turning point. His death had forced the Colombian government to act, had pushed the extradition policy forward, had turned international eyes toward the cartel's brutality. And in the end, Escobar met the same fate as his victims. On December 2, 1993, after years on the run, Colombia's most infamous drug lord was gunned down on a Medellín rooftop. The man who had once declared war on the state lay lifeless in a pool of his own blood. His empire collapsed. His name became a cautionary tale. But the war against corruption, against crime, against the forces that Lara Bonilla had fought so hard to resist, it did not end with Escobar. It continues to this day. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla did not live to see the fall of the man who ordered his execution. But his courage, his defiance, his refusal to bow to fear, those things did not die with him. His legacy remains a reminder of the cost of standing against power, but also of the impact that one voice, one man, can have against impossible odds. If you want more stories of history's most chilling moments, Subscribe now. There's always more to uncover, more to learn, and more hidden truths waiting to be revealed.